On a Tuesday morning in late September of 2019, Macon County, Tennessee, had a problem it had been ignoring for 11 years. 40 acres of what the county assessor's office still listed as agricultural land, unimproved, had been swallowed whole by Kudzu. Not overgrown, not neglected, swallowed. The vine had come in the way Kudzu always comes in Tennessee. Quietly at first, a green tendril here, a soft blanket there, and then all at once, like a tide that forgot to go back out. By the fall of 2019, the 40 acres on the old Whitaker tract off County Road 7 looked like something a child had covered with a green bedsheet. The fence lines were gone. The tree shapes were gone. The distinction between ground and air was gone. There was only Kudzu, rolling and billowing in the September heat, a solid mass of it, 8 and 10 and in some places 15 feet deep, covering whatever the land had been before anyone alive could remember. The county had tried to clear it twice. Let me tell you about those attempts, because they matter. The first attempt came in the spring of 2017, when the Macon County road crew brought in a contractor named Trent Ashford out of Gallatin. Trent ran a land clearing operation that had been featured in a regional trade publication the previous year. He had 2 forestry mulchers, a Fecon FTX 148 and a John Deere 643L, and he had cleared Kudzu off highway rights-of-way across 4 counties. He was confident. He quoted the county $38,000 for the job and told the road supervisor it would take 3 weeks. The Fecon went in first, its drum spinning at 1,800 revolutions per minute, and for the first 2 days it worked beautifully. Kudzu shredded. The air smelled like cut vegetation. Trent stood at the field edge with his arms crossed and watched his machine eat through the green mass and thought the job was going well. Then the machine hit the terrain underneath. The land under the Kudzu was not flat. It was broken. Old foundation rubble, brick and limestone, concrete footings, buried timber, the collapsed remnants of structures nobody had mapped, because nobody had seen the ground in 11 years. The Fecon's drum hit a buried limestone foundation corner at full speed, and the impact cracked the drum housing. Trent pulled the machine out. Repair cost $14,200. The county paid half. The job stopped. The second attempt came in the fall of 2018. This time, the county hired a different contractor, a spray operation out of Lafayette that used a combination of triclopyr and imazapyr applied by a tractor-mounted boom sprayer. The herbicide application was thorough, and the Kudzu died on the surface. The vines turned brown and brittle, and the county road supervisor drove out and thought the problem was solved. What the herbicide did not kill was the root crowns. Kudzu root crowns can go 6 feet deep and weigh up to 100 pounds. The spray had killed the canopy but left the root system intact, and by the following June the Kudzu was back, as dense as it had ever been. The county had spent $11,500 on the spray application and gained nothing but a winter's worth of brown vines before the green came back. The road supervisor, a man named Dale Crowley, who had held the position for 16 years and who had opinions about most things, told the county commission that the Whitaker tract was a write-off. Some problems, he said at the October 2019 commission meeting, are bigger than the budget. The commission agreed and tabled the discussion. That was the situation on a Tuesday morning in late September of 2019. Let me tell you about Greta Vandermeer, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from almost every character this channel has told you about before. Greta was 23 years old in the fall of 2019. She had grown up on a dairy operation in Fillmore County, Minnesota, the third of 4 children in a family that had been farming the same ground since her great-grandfather came over from the Netherlands in 1921. She understood farming the way children who grow up on farms understand it, not as a career choice but as a condition of existence, the same way you understand weather or gravity. She had graduated the previous spring from the University of Tennessee's College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources with a degree in sustainable agriculture, and she had done it in 3.5 years instead of 4, because she had taken overloads every semester and tested out of 2 introductory courses. Her advisor at UT, a professor named Dr. Anita Srinivasan, who ran the university's agroecology program, had told Greta in her junior year that she had one of the most naturally integrated minds for systems thinking she had seen in 20 years of teaching. Greta had written that down in the spiral notebook she carried everywhere. She wrote a lot of things down. She'd come to Macon County in the spring of 2019 because her father's cousin, a man named Peter Vandermeer, had a small goat operation there. 40 boar cross does, and a handful of Spanish cross bucks. And Peter was getting older and needed help, and had offered Greta a place to stay and a modest wage in exchange for labor and management assistance. Greta had said yes because Macon County was beautiful, and because she had an idea she'd been carrying around since her junior year, and she needed land to test it on. The idea had to do with goats. Specifically, it had to do with what goats could do to Kudzu. Let me tell you about the science, because you need to understand it before you can understand what Greta proposed to the county. Kudzu is not invincible. It is aggressive, and it is persistent, and it wins against most conventional clearing methods because those methods attack the canopy without addressing the root system, and Kudzu's root system is the actual plant. The vine you see is just the expression of it. But goats do not attack the canopy. Goats attack the plant at every level they can reach, and what makes them particularly effective against Kudzu is a combination of factors that most people who have never studied the problem would not think to consider. First, goats are browsers, not grazers. They prefer woody, leafy, high cellulose vegetation, exactly what Kudzu is, over grass. Second, goats will eat Kudzu repeatedly through a growing season, and each time they defoliate the vine, they force the root crown to spend energy it had stored for winter. Do this enough times across enough seasons, and the root crown exhausts itself. Third, and this is the part that Greta had gotten from Dr. Srinivasan's research, and from a series of studies out of the University of Georgia's Extension program, goats can navigate broken, irregular terrain that machines cannot. They do not care about buried foundations. They do not care about collapsed timber. They step over it, around it, through it. They go where the Kudzu is, not where the equipment can reach. The University of Georgia data that Greta had in her notebook showed that managed goat grazing on established kudzu infestations, done correctly with proper rotation and stocking density, could reduce kudzu canopy coverage by 60 to 80% in the first season and achieve near-complete root crown depletion in 2 to 3 seasons of sustained grazing. The cost per acre for a managed goat operation, when you factored in the animal's own nutritional gain from the kudzu, ran between $200 and $400 per acre over 3 years. The county had already spent roughly $1,400 per acre on 2 failed mechanical and chemical attempts. Greta had those numbers in her notebook too. She brought the notebook to Peter's kitchen table in October of 2019, 3 weeks after the county commission had tabled the Whitaker tract discussion. Peter sat across from her with a cup of coffee and listened while she laid it out. The Georgia studies, the stocking density calculations, the rotation schedule, the cost comparison, the timeline. Peter was 61 years old and had been around goats his entire adult life, and he did not say anything for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "You'd need more animals than I've got." Greta said she knew that. She said she had been in contact with 2 other small goat operations in the county and one in Smith County, who had animals they would lease out for the season at a rate that still came in under the county's per-acre cost on the failed attempts. Peter looked at the notebook for a while. Then he looked at Greta. Then he said, "You'd need the county to give you access to the land." Greta said she knew that too. His wife, a quiet woman named Annika, who had been washing dishes at the sink and had not appeared to be listening, dried her hands on a dish towel and said, without turning around, "She's right, Peter. You know she's right." Peter picked up the coffee cup. He set it down. He said, "All right, let's go talk to Dale Crowley. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room with a good idea and watched someone laugh at it before you finish the second sentence? Have you ever felt the particular frustration of knowing, not believing, knowing that you had the right answer, and watching the person who needed the answer most refuse to hear it because of who was delivering it? Because what happened at the Macon County Road Department office on a Thursday morning in October of 2019 was one of those moments, and I want you to hold it in mind as the rest of this story unfolds. Dale Crowley had been road supervisor for 16 years. He was 54 years old, a Macon County native, and he had a way of sitting behind his desk that communicated, without words, that he had heard most things before and found most of them wanting. He was not a cruel man. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had learned, over 16 years of county government, that most ideas brought to him by people who did not have his experience cost more than they saved and created problems he was then responsible for solving. He had that kind of institutional caution that calcifies, over time, into something that looks from the outside like wisdom and feels from the inside like certainty. When Peter Vandermeer came in with his young cousin from Minnesota and her spiral notebook, Dale Crowley leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on his desk and waited. Greta was 23 years old, and she was wearing a Carhartt jacket over a flannel shirt, and she had mud on her boots from Peter's barn. And she put the notebook on Dale Crowley's desk, and she started talking. She got through the Georgia studies and the stock and density numbers and the cost comparison before Dale Crowley's expression changed. His expression changed the way a man's expression changes when he has already decided something and is waiting for the other person to finish so he can say what he has already decided. He let her finish the cost comparison. Then he said, "So your plan is to turn goats loose on the Whitaker tract." He said it the way you might say, "So your plan is to fix the roof with a paper bag." Greta said it was a managed rotational grazing program, not turning goats loose, and that the distinction mattered because the rotation schedule was what drove the root crown depletion. Dale Crowley nodded slowly. He looked at Peter. He said, "Peter, I've known you 20 years. I respect your operation, but I'm not going to authorize public land access for a goat experiment designed by a college kid." He paused. No offense. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale Crowley smiled, and it was not a mean smile, which somehow made it worse. It was the smile of a man who considered the matter settled. "The liability alone," he said, and he shook his head, and that was apparently the end of it. Greta picked up the notebook. She looked at Dale Crowley for a moment. She said, "The county has spent $49,500 on that tract in 2 years, and the Kudzu is back." Dale Crowley said he was aware of that. Greta said, "The Georgia data shows a 70% canopy reduction in the first season at a cost of under $6,000 for 40 acres." Dale Crowley said that Georgia was not Tennessee. Greta said Kudzu did not read state lines. Dale Crowley stood up, which in county office language means the meeting is over. He said he appreciated her coming in. He said if the county revisited the Whitaker tract budget in the next fiscal cycle, he would keep her proposal in mind. He said this the way people say things they do not mean. Peter put his hand briefly on Greta's shoulder, and they walked out. In the truck on the way back, Peter said, "I'm sorry." Greta looked out the window at the October hills and said, "He'll come around." Peter said, "Dale Crowley has not come around on anything since 2009. Greta said, "Then it'll be good for him." She opened the notebook to a fresh page and started writing. Let me tell you about what Greta did next, because it is the part of this story that most people who tell it leave out. She did not wait for the county. She went to the landowner. The Whitaker tract had been in a complicated ownership situation since the death of the last Whitaker heir in 2008, which was part of why the county had been managing it at all. The estate had been in probate for years, and the county had assumed maintenance responsibility under a nuisance abatement agreement. But the land itself was not county land. It belonged, after 11 years of legal untangling, to a woman named Frances Whitaker Ostrander, who lived in Nashville and had inherited it from her uncle, and had never once visited it, and had been receiving annual nuisance abatement invoices from Macon County for 3 years, and was not happy about any of this. Greta found Frances Whitaker Ostrander's contact information through the county assessor's records, which are public, and she called her on a Wednesday afternoon in November of 2019. She explained who she was and what she proposed. Frances Whitaker Ostrander listened. She asked 2 questions. The first was whether Greta's plan would stop the nuisance abatement invoices. Greta said it would eventually, and that in the first season the county would likely see enough improvement to suspend active management. The second question was whether there was any cost to Frances. Greta said there was not. The goat operation would use the kudzu as forage, which had nutritional value, and the arrangement would be structured as a grazing lease at no charge to the landowner in exchange for access. Frances Whitaker Ostrander said, "Young lady, you have my permission to put every goat in Tennessee on that property." She mailed a signed access agreement to Peter's address within the week. Greta brought the signed access agreement to Dale Crowley's office on a Monday morning in December of 2019. She did not make an appointment. She walked in, put the document on his desk, and said, "I have landowner permission. I don't need county authorization to access private land. I'm letting you know as a courtesy." Dale Crowley read the document. He read it twice. He said, "You called Frances Whitaker." It was not quite a question. Greta said she had. Dale Crowley looked at the document for another moment. He said, "You're going to do this whether I think it's a good idea or not." Greta said that was correct. Dale Crowley set the document down. He said, "Don't let the goats onto the county road right of way." Greta said she had a portable electric fencing plan that would prevent exactly that. Dale Crowley looked at her for a long moment. He said, "All right." He did not say good luck. He did not say he hoped she was right. He picked up the phone on his desk, which meant the meeting was over, and Greta walked out with the access agreement in her hand. She started in April of 2020. Let me tell you about the first season, because the first season was not a triumph. It was something more important than a triumph. It was proof of concept in the hardest possible conditions. Greta had assembled, through Peter's herd and the 2 leased operations, and a 4th she had found in Smith County, a total of 94 goats, 71 does and 23 wethers, a mix of Boer cross and Spanish cross animals that were hardy, aggressive browsers with the kind of constitutions that come from generations of selection for rough country foraging. She divided the 40 acres into 8 paddocks using portable electric netting, each paddock roughly 5 acres, and she moved the herd through on a 12-day rotation, 12 days in, then out to let the Kudzu attempt to recover before the goats came back. The rotation schedule was not arbitrary. It was derived from the Georgia study's finding that 12 to 14 days was the minimum recovery window needed to trigger the Kudzu plant's stress response. The biochemical signal that told the root crown to send up new growth, which then got eaten again, which depleted the crown's energy reserves faster than a longer recovery window would. Greta had explained this to Peter and to the 2 other goat owners, and they had all nodded in the way people nod when they are following the logic but reserving judgment on the outcome. The terrain under the Kudzu was everything the Fecon had found and more. In the first paddock alone, Greta mapped 3 collapsed structures, what appeared to be a barn foundation, a root cellar, and a smaller outbuilding of some kind, along with 2 old cisterns, a hand-dug well with a partial stone coping, a section of split-rail fence still upright under the vines, and what appeared to be a brick-paved path leading from one structure to another. The goats found all of it before she did. They moved through the terrain without hesitation, stepping over collapsed timber, picking their way around the cistern openings, browsing the Kudzu off every surface it had covered, and what emerged behind them, slowly, as the weeks passed, was something that stopped Greta in her tracks the first time she walked a cleared paddock. The Whitaker tract was not just agricultural land. It was a homestead, a complete, intact, 19th century farmstead, buried under 11 years of Kudzu. House foundation, barn, smokehouse, root cellar, kitchen garden walls, orchard trees still alive under the vine canopy, a wagon road running from the county road to the barn. All of it there, all of it waiting. The Kudzu had not destroyed it. The Kudzu had covered it so completely that nobody had known it was there. Greta started photographing everything. She called the Tennessee Historical Commission in June of 2020 and described what she was finding. A field archaeologist named Dr. James Sorensen drove up from Nashville in July and spent 2 days walking the cleared paddocks with Greta, and came back to his truck looking like a man who had found something he had not expected to find. He told Greta the farmstead dated to approximately the 1840s, and that the preservation state of the structural elements was, given the Kudzu cover, remarkable. He said the root cellar alone was worth documenting. He filed a preliminary survey report with the Historical Commission and recommended the site for further evaluation. He also told Greta, somewhat quietly, that if the Kudzu had not been cleared, the site would have continued to deteriorate under the vine mass and would likely have been unrecoverable within another decade. Greta wrote that down. By the end of the first season, in October of 2020, the goats had cleared 28 of the 40 acres to a state where the ground was visible and the root crowns were under active stress. Kudzu canopy coverage on cleared paddocks was down 65% from the baseline photographs Greta had taken in April. The remaining 12 acres, the paddocks with the heaviest initial vine depth and the most complex terrain, would need a second season. The cost for the first season, including leasing fees for the outside animals, portable fencing materials, water infrastructure, and Greta's own labor, had come to $4,840. The county had spent $49,500 and not cleared an acre. Greta put together a one-page summary with the numbers and the before and after photographs and sent it to Dale Crowley's office by mail. She did not request a meeting. She did not ask for anything. She just sent the numbers. Let me tell you about what happened in Macon County between October of 2020 and the spring of 2021, because it is the part of the story that happens in the spaces between the documented facts, in the conversations at the Macon County Co-op and the Advance Auto Parts on the square and the booths at the diner on Highway 52. People started driving out to County Road 7, not in any organized way. Not because anyone announced anything, but word had gotten around, the way word gets around in a county of 24,000 people where everyone knows everyone's business, that the Vandermeer girl had done something out on the old Whitaker place with goats, and that you could drive out there and see ground that hadn't been visible since the Obama administration. And people did drive out. They parked on the county road shoulder and looked through the portable fencing at the cleared paddocks and at the stone foundations and the orchard trees and the wagon road, and most of them did not say much, because rural Tennesseans are not in the habit of making speeches about things they are seeing for the first time. But they looked, and they talked about what they saw later in the places where rural Tennesseans talk about things. Dale Crowley drove out in November of 2020. Greta did not know he was coming. She was moving the fencing for the winter rotation when she saw his county truck pull onto the shoulder. He got out and stood at the fence line for a while. She walked over. He looked at the cleared ground and the barn foundation and the orchard trees for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "How much of this did you know was under there when you started?" Greta said she had suspected there were structural remnants based on the county's historical records, but that she had not known the extent of it. Dale Crowley said, "The Historical Commission called me." Greta said she knew. He said they were recommending the site for the State Historic Register. Greta said she knew that too. Dale Crowley looked at the cleared ground for another moment. He said, "You said the Kudzu would be gone in 2 to 3 seasons." Greta said yes. He said, "What's the cost projection for season 2? She told him. He was quiet. Then he said, "The county would like to contribute to the cost of season 2. Greta looked at him. He said, "As a co-sponsor of the clearing project, given the historical significance." Greta said, "Dale, the county spent $49,500 on 2 failed attempts and told me my plan was a goat experiment designed by a college kid." Dale Crowley's jaw moved slightly. He said, "I know what I said." Greta said, "I'd like you to say what you're actually saying." Dale Crowley looked at the barn foundation for a moment. He said, "I was wrong about the approach, and I should have listened." He said it the way men who are not accustomed to saying such things say them, quietly, without decoration, looking at something other than the person they are saying it to. Greta let it sit for a moment. Then she said, "The county's contribution would be welcome. I'll send you the season 2 plan." She went back to moving the fencing. Dale Crowley stood at the fence line for another minute, then got back in his truck and drove away. Let me tell you about the second season, because the second season was where the remaining 12 acres came clear and where the homestead revealed its last and most significant secret. Greta brought the herd back in March of 2021. The 12 remaining acres were the most difficult ground on the tract, a low section near the back boundary where the kudzu had been deepest, in some places 18 feet of accumulated vine mass over terrain that included what the goats, in the first week of the second season, revealed to be a collapsed spring house over an active spring. The spring was still running. It had been running under 18 feet of kudzu in the dark for 11 years, feeding a small creek that ran along the back boundary and that Greta had not known existed because the kudzu had covered it completely. The spring house walls were limestone, dry stacked, and 3 of the 4 walls were intact. The 4th had partially collapsed inward, which was what had made the structure invisible even to the goats until they cleared the vine mass off the top. Dr. Sorensen came back in April of 2021 and spent a week on the site. He brought 2 graduate students. They documented 23 distinct structural elements across the 40 acres: the main house foundation, the barn, the smokehouse, the root cellar, the spring house, the well, 2 outbuildings, the kitchen garden walls, a stone-lined drainage channel, the wagon road, the orchard, and 11 other features that the preliminary survey had not identified. He told Greta that the Whitaker homestead was one of the most intact mid-19th century farmstead sites documented in Middle Tennessee in the past 30 years, and that its preservation was entirely attributable to the kudzu cover, which, paradoxically, had protected the stone and brick elements from the weathering and vandalism that had destroyed comparable sites elsewhere. The kudzu had buried the homestead. The kudzu had also saved it. Greta wrote that down. By October of 2021, the 40 acres were clear. Not partially clear. Clear. The final kudzu canopy coverage measurement, taken by Greta and verified by a University of Tennessee extension agent named Marcus Webb, who had been following the project since the first season, was 4%. Scattered regrowth on the margins that the goats would address in a maintenance rotation the following spring. The root crown density in the paddocks that had received 2 full seasons of rotational grazing had dropped to a level that Webb described in his notes as functionally depleted, meaning the plants were present but lacked the energy reserves to mount the kind of aggressive regrowth that had characterized the site before. The total cost for both seasons, including the county's co-sponsorship contribution in Season 2, had come to $9,200 for 40 acres over 2 years. That was $230 per acre. The county's 2 failed attempts had cost $1,237 per acre and had cleared nothing. Marcus Webb wrote up the project as a case study for the UT Extension Service. He sent a draft to Greta before he submitted it. She read it and sent back 2 corrections to the stocking density figures and 1 correction to the rotation interval calculation. He made the corrections and submitted it. The case study was published in the Extension Service's quarterly bulletin in the spring of 2022 under both their names. Greta's name was listed first because Webb insisted on it. Let me tell you about what happened at the Macon County Commission meeting in January of 2022, because it is the moment this story became something larger than 1 woman and 40 acres. Greta had been invited to present the project results to the full commission. She had not asked to present. Dale Crowley had put her on the agenda. She wore a flannel shirt and work pants, and she had her notebook, and she stood at the front of the commission room, and she went through the numbers the same way she had gone through them in Dale Crowley's office 2 years earlier. except that this time she had 2 seasons of documented results and a published Extension Service case study and before and after photographs that she projected on the wall behind her. The commission room held about 40 people. It was full. Farmers, mostly. Some county staff. Dr. Sorensen was there. Marcus Webb was there. Peter and Annika Vandermeer were in the 3rd row. She went through the cost comparison. She went through the root crown depletion data. She went through the historical commission findings. She put up the photograph of the spring house, the one taken in April of 2021 with the goats visible in the background and the intact limestone walls in the foreground, and the spring water catching the morning light. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when people are absorbing something that changes their understanding of a situation. When she finished, one of the commissioners, a man named Hal Jensen, who farmed 160 acres in the eastern part of the county, said, "What would it cost to do this on my back 40? I've got a kudzu problem I've been ignoring for 6 years." Greta gave him the per-acre estimate. He wrote it down. 2 other farmers in the room asked the same question. Greta gave them the same estimate. She answered questions for 40 minutes. When the meeting ended, she was still standing at the front of the room answering questions from farmers who had lined up to talk to her. And Peter was standing against the back wall watching, and Annika was sitting next to him. And Annika reached over and took Peter's hand without saying anything. Let me tell you about what happened in the 3 years after that meeting, because the story does not end in January of 2022. By the end of 2022, Greta had contracted with 7 Macon County landowners to run managed goat grazing programs on kudzu-infested acreage. The smallest contract was 12 acres. The largest was 83. She had formalized the operation as a limited liability company, Vandermeer Agroecology Services, LLC, and had hired 1 part-time assistant, a young man from the county named Caleb Briggs, who had grown up on a cattle farm and had the kind of practical animal handling skills that complemented Greta's scientific background. She had expanded the goat herd through a combination of purchased animals and continued lease arrangements to 180 head. She had a waiting list. In 2023, Marcus Webb nominated the Whitaker Tract Project for the Tennessee Association of Conservation Districts' Annual Excellence Award. It won. Greta drove to Nashville in October of 2023 to accept it. She wore the same Carhartt jacket she had worn to Dale Crowley's office in December of 2019. Peter was in the audience. When they called her name and she walked to the podium, Peter stood up. He was the first person standing. Then the rest of the room stood, and Greta stood at the podium for a moment before she started speaking, and she looked out at the room, and she found Peter's face in the crowd, and she did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I want to start by telling you about a 40-acre piece of ground in Macon County, Tennessee, that everyone had given up on." She had the notebook on the podium. She did not open it. She knew what she wanted to say. She talked about the kudzu and the failed attempts and the goats and the rotation schedule and the homestead underneath. She talked about the spring house and the spring that had been running in the dark for 11 years. She talked about what the Georgia studies had shown and what the UT Extension case study had documented and what the numbers meant in terms of cost per acre and root crown depletion rates. She talked about what it meant for a community to have a tool available to it that it had not been willing to consider because the person proposing the tool was 23 years old and had mud on her boots and a spiral notebook instead of 16 years of institutional experience. She said, "The ground doesn't care how long you've been doing the job. The kudzu doesn't care what your title is. The spring under the spring house was running the whole time. It just needed someone to clear the vine off the top so people could see it. She paused. She said, "Any land that's been written off as a problem is usually just land that hasn't been looked at correctly yet." The room was quiet. Then it wasn't. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because his part of this story deserves more than a footnote. He had attended the January 2022 commission meeting. He had sat in the second row and listened to Greta's presentation without saying anything. After the meeting, when the farmers were lined up to ask Greta questions, Dale Crowley had waited until the room thinned out, and then he had walked to the front and stood next to Greta while she was packing up her notebook, and he had said, "The county would like to formalize the relationship, if you're willing." Greta had looked at him. He said, "There are 3 other county-managed tracts with significant kudzu coverage. I'd like to bring you in on all 3. Greta said, "Dale, you told me my plan was a goat experiment designed by a college kid." She said it without heat, just the words, flat and accurate. Dale Crowley said, "I know." He said, "I've been doing this job for 18 years, and I was wrong about this, and I want to do something about it." Greta looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The lesson isn't that goats are better than mulchers. The lesson is that any land management problem that gets addressed with the same failed tool twice without asking why it failed is a problem that's going to keep getting worse. The county needs a process for evaluating unconventional proposals on their merits." Dale Crowley said, "I know that too." He said, "I'm asking for your help building it." Greta said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she called Dale Crowley's office and said she was in. Over the following 2 years, Greta and Dale Crowley developed what the county eventually formalized as the Macon County Alternative Land Management Review Protocol, a 1-page process by which unconventional land management proposals could be submitted to the road department and evaluated against documented evidence rather than institutional habit. It was not a complicated document. It did not require a committee or a budget line or a consultant. It required that proposals include a cost comparison to existing approaches, a documented precedent from at least one other jurisdiction, and a defined success metric. That was it. 3 things. Dale Crowley presented it to the commission in the fall of 2023, and it passed unanimously. He told the commission it had come out of a conversation with Greta Vandermeer, and that he wished he had been willing to have that conversation 3 years earlier. He said this in public at the commission meeting, on the record. Greta was not at that meeting. She was out on the 83-acre contract in the eastern part of the county, moving fencing. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has one more turn, and it is the turn that matters most. In the spring of 2024, Greta was sitting at Peter's kitchen table, the same table where she had laid out the Georgia studies and the stocking density calculations in October of 2019, and Peter's youngest daughter, a 16-year-old named Liesel, who had been helping Greta move fencing on weekends for 2 years, sat down across from her with a piece of paper covered in handwritten notes and said, "I've been reading about silvopasture." Greta looked up from the contract she was reviewing. Liesel said, "It's a system where you integrate trees into the pasture so the animals have shade and browse, and the trees get fertilized by the animals, and you get timber or fruit or nuts as a secondary crop. There's research out of the Savannah Institute in Wisconsin and a bunch of USDA agroforestry studies." She pushed the paper across the table. "I think we could do it on the cleared Whitaker ground. The orchard trees are already there. We'd just be building the system around what's already surviving." Greta looked at the notes. She looked at the orchard trees Liesel had sketched in the margin of the paper. She thought about the spring house and the spring that had been running in the dark and the homestead that had been waiting under the kudzu for someone to clear the vine off the top. She thought about Dr. Srinivasan's office in Knoxville and the spiral notebook and the drive to Macon County in the spring of 2019, with an idea she had been carrying since her junior year. She looked at Liesel. She said, "Show me the Savannah Institute data." Liesel slid the rest of the notes across the table. Greta pulled them toward her and started reading. Peter was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He had come in from the barn and had not said anything. He watched Greta reading Liesel's notes with the same expression he had worn at this table 5 years earlier when Greta had pushed her own notebook across to him. He did not say anything. He went to the counter and poured a cup of coffee and stood there, and the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of pages turning. The Whitaker homestead is still there. The spring is still running. The orchard trees that survived 11 years under the kudzu are leafing out for the 4th spring since the vines came off. Dr. Sorensen's survey is complete, and the site is on the State Historic Register, and there are plans, still unfunded but real, for an interpretive trail along the wagon road. Vandermeer Agroecology Services has cleared 340 acres of kudzu-infested land across 4 counties in 3 years at an average cost of $218 per acre. The 2 forestry mulchers and the spray contractor and the institutional habit of doing what had always been done had cleared nothing and spent more than anyone wanted to count. Greta Vandermeer planted goats in a mulcher county. They laughed. The kudzu stayed. The mulchers broke. The goats kept eating. The homestead came up out of the ground like something that had been waiting to breathe, and underneath the last of the vines, the spring was still running, the same as it had always been, the same as it would have kept running whether anyone ever found it or not. The ground doesn't read the sign on your dealership. It doesn't read your job title or your years of service or your institutional caution. It just holds what it holds and waits for someone willing to look at it differently.